April 15th, 1815. The Ashford townhouse ballroom glowed with the warm light of 100 candles, their flames reflected infinitely in the gilt-edged mirrors that lined the walls, creating an illusion of endless space and endless beauty. White roses and lilacs perfumed the air, their sweet scent mingling with expensive perfumes and the faint musk of anticipation. It was the opening night of the London social season, and everyone who mattered had gathered beneath the crystal chandeliers to see and be seen, to dance and to court, to begin again the ancient ritual of pairing that defined their world. Eleanor Ashford sat at the pianoforte in the corner, her fingers moving across the ivory keys with practiced grace, playing the familiar patterns that accompanied other people's happiness. She wore dove grey, as she always did, a colour that allowed her to fade into the background, to become part of the furniture rather than part of the festivities. At 24, she had long since accepted her role in these glittering assemblies. She was the useful one, the poor relation who earned her keep by making herself indispensable. While her cousins danced, she played. While they laughed and flirted, she provided the soundtrack to their triumphs. Her aunt, Lady Catherine Ashford, had taken her in when her parents died, a charity that was never allowed to be forgotten. In exchange for room and board, Eleanor managed the household accounts, oversaw the servants, and most importantly, did not compete with her beautiful cousins for the attention of eligible men. Not that there was any danger of that. Eleanor had heard the whispers often enough to have them memorized, could recite them like a cruel catechism. Too plain. Unfortunate features. No fortune, no face. Pity, really, when you consider how lovely Isabella and Sophia are. A sparrow among swans. The words no longer had the power to wound her, or so she told herself, as her fingers found the next chord, the next phrase. She had made her peace with invisibility. There was a certain freedom in being overlooked, a quiet dignity in being useful. She did not need to hope for a love match or dream of a husband. Such dreams were for girls with dowries and beauty, girls like Isabella in her pale blue silk that matched her eyes, or Sophia in pink that complemented her golden curls. They swirled past in the arms of various gentlemen, their laughter bright as bells, and Eleanor played on, her own small rebellion contained in her choice of music, complex pieces that satisfied something in her soul, even if no one listened closely enough to appreciate the skill required. The evening stretched ahead, predictable and safe. Another night of resigned melancholy dressed up as contentment. She did not know that everything was about to change. She did not know that her carefully constructed acceptance was about to be shattered. She simply played, her dove-grey dress blending into the shadows, her heart locked away where it could not be. Broken, her dreams buried so deep she had almost convinced herself they no longer existed. The shift in the ballroom was subtle at first, a change in the quality of attention, a redirection of energy toward the doorway where two gentlemen had just entered. Eleanor felt it before she saw it, that particular stirring that marked the arrival of someone significant, and she glanced up from her playing just long enough to see him. Thomas Pembroke, Duke of Pembroke, stood framed in the entrance, and even from across the room she could feel the authority he carried. Not the pompous self-importance of so many titled men, but something quieter and more substantial, a natural command that required no announcement. He was 32, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark evening coat perfectly tailored to his frame, his expression composed but observant, as his gaze swept the assembly with what seemed like genuine interest rather than mere social scanning. Beside him stood Lord Frederick Harcourt, speaking into his ear with animated gestures, but the Duke's attention had already moved on, cataloguing faces and scenes with the precision of someone who missed very little. Eleanor looked down quickly, her fingers finding the next phrase of Mozart's Sonata No. 11, the familiar patterns offering safety from the dangerous flutter of awareness in her chest. He would dance with Isabella, surely, or perhaps Sophia. They were both strategically positioned near the refreshment table where they could be easily approached, Isabella's pale blue silk catching the candlelight like water, Sophia's pink creating a softer glow. Eleanor told herself it did not matter, that she had no stake in which beauty the Duke chose to favor, and yet she found herself hyper-aware of his location in the room, tracking his movement through the crowd without directly looking, her fingers touching the piano keys with the light, nervous pressure that was her unconscious habit when anxious. Lord Chamberlain swept Isabella into a waltz, and Eleanor watched the Duke watch them, his expression unreadable. Frederick said something that made him smile slightly, a transformation that softened the austere lines of his face and made him suddenly, devastatingly handsome. Then, inexplicably, impossibly, his gaze moved across the room and settled on her. Eleanor's fingers stumbled on the keys, a discordant note breaking the melody before she recovered. But the damage was done. He had heard. He was looking directly at her now, his attention focused with an intensity that made her breath catch. She forced herself to concentrate on the music, to ignore the way her heart had begun to race, telling herself she was agining his interest, that he was merely looking in her general direction. But then he was moving, not toward the dancers or the refreshment table, but deliberately, purposefully across the ballroom floor toward the corner where she sat. Frederick followed, looking amused. Eleanor's mind went blank with panic, and something dangerously close to hope. She kept playing because she did not know what else to do, her fingers executing the sonata from pure memory, while her conscious mind spun uselessly. He stopped beside the pianoforte, close enough that she could smell the subtle scent of sandalwood, and something crisp like winter air. His voice, when he spoke, was deeper than she had expected, warm and cultured. "Miss Ashford, I believe. Your playing is extraordinary. I have rarely heard Mozart rendered with such feeling." April 16, 1815. Morning light filtered through the tall windows of the Ashford breakfast room, illuminating the silver tea service and the carefully arranged fruit that no one would eat, casting everything in the deceptively warm glow of a spring morning that promised more than it would deliver. Eleanor sat at the foot of the long mahogany table, her usual position, the place that marked her status as clearly as if it had been labeled, and tried to focus on the toast before her while her mind replayed. Against her will, every moment of the previous evening, every word the Duke of Pembroke had spoken to her, the way his eyes had held hers with such apparent interest, the warmth in his voice when he complimented her playing. She had barely slept, her thoughts circling endlessly between dangerous hope and familiar self-protection. And now, in the cold light of morning, she felt foolish for having allowed even a moment's worth of fantasy to take root. He had been polite, nothing more. The sort of courtesy any well-bred gentleman might extend to the poor relation providing the evening's entertainment. At the head of the table, Aunt Catherine presided in a morning dress of deep purple that made her look rather like an elegant, disapproving plum, her sharp eyes missing nothing as she buttered her bread with precise, controlled movements. Isabella sat to her right in ice-blue muslin that matched her eyes, and Sophia to her left in a confection of pink ribbons, both of them glowing with the particular satisfaction of young women who had enjoyed a successful evening. "He is quite the most eligible bachelor of the season," Isabella declared, her voice carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to getting what she wanted. "The Duke of Pembroke, I mean. His fortune is immense, and Pembroke House is said to be one of the finest estates in England." Sophia laughed, a silvery sound like bells. "And so very handsome. Did you see how he moved through the ballroom?" Everyone was watching him. I am certain he noticed me particularly when I was dancing the quadrille. Aunt Catherine's expression took on the calculating quality Eleanor knew well, the look of someone arranging chess pieces on a board. "He would be a magnificent match for either of you girls. We must ensure he receives invitations to every event we attend. Eleanor, you will write the notes this afternoon." "Of course, Aunt Catherine," Eleanor murmured, keeping her eyes on her plate, feeling the familiar weight of her position settle back over her shoulders like a well-worn cloak. The fantasy of the previous evening dissolved in the face of this reality. Of course, the Duke would pursue Isabella or Sophia. Of course, his attention to her had been mere politeness. What else could it have been? "I heard Lady Sinclair mention that the Duke will be at the opera on the 18th, Isabella said, her voice taking on a proprietary tone. "We must ensure we have a box where he will see us." Sophia nodded eagerly. "And the garden party at the Wentworth estate next week. He is certain to attend." Eleanor felt something twist in her chest, a sensation she refused to name disappointment, because that would require admitting she had hoped, and hope was a luxury she could not afford. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. April 18th, 1815. The Opera House at Covent Garden blazed with light and ambition, every box filled with London's elite arranged in tiers like a glittering judgment upon the stage below, though Eleanor suspected most had come not to hear Rossini's Il Barbiere di Siviglia, but to see and be seen, to calculate social positions and arrange advantageous connections in the intervals between arias. She sat at the back of the Ashford box, her dove-grey dress now adorned with Aunt Catherine's pearl necklace, a concession that had surprised her that morning when her aunt had fastened it around her throat with uncharacteristic attention, though Eleanor understood it was less about adorning her than about presenting the family well should certain eyes happen to fall upon them. The red velvet of the box's interior created an intimate cave of luxury, and Isabella and Sophia occupied the front seats where they could be most easily observed from across the theatre. Isabella's posture perfect in pale blue silk that caught every flicker of gaslight, Sophia arranging her pink skirts with calculated casualness. Eleanor tried to focus on the music, on the bright cascade of the soprano's voice as she navigated Rossini's aria. But her attention kept drifting to the boxes across the way, searching without meaning to search, looking without admitting she was looking, until she found him. The Duke of Pembroke sat in a box directly opposite, his dark evening coat a stark contrast to the crimson velvet behind him, and even from this distance she could see the focused quality of his attention, the way he seemed actually to be listening to the music rather than merely attending it. Frederick Harcourt sat beside him, leaning over to whisper something, but Thomas, she had begun thinking of him as Thomas in the privacy of her thoughts, though she would never dare speak his name aloud, kept his gaze on the stage. Eleanor told herself she was relieved he had not noticed their box, that it was better this way, safer, less likely to lead to the disappointment she knew awaited any foolish hope she might harbor. The first act ended, and the interval began, that peculiar organized chaos when everyone moved and visited and performed the intricate social dance that mattered far more than anything happening on stage. Isabella rose immediately, positioning herself where she might be easily approached, and Sophia followed suit, both of them glowing with anticipation. Aunt Catherine surveyed the theatre with the keen eye of a general assessing a battlefield. Eleanor remained in her seat, content to be invisible, but then she saw movement in the box opposite, saw Thomas rise, saw him glance across the theatre directly at their box, saw him speak briefly to Frederick before moving toward the corridor with unmistakable purpose. Her heart began a rhythm that had nothing to do with Rossini. Lady Beatrice Sinclair, presiding over the adjacent box like a plump spider in diamonds, leaned forward with obvious interest, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Eleanor's hands twisted in her lap, that nervous gesture she could never quite control. Then he was there, in the doorway of their box, tall and commanding, and looking not at Isabella or Sophia, but directly, immediately, unmistakably at her. April 20th, 1815. The afternoon sun filtered through the new leaves of Hyde Park's ancient trees, dappling the carefully maintained paths with shifting patterns of light and shadow that seemed to dance in time with Eleanor's uncertain heartbeat, as their carriage rolled along Rotten Row at the fashionable hour when all of London society came to see and be seen, to parade their finest clothes and most elegant equipages in an endless performance of status and ambition. She sat beside Aunt Catherine in the open barouche, wearing a walking dress of ivory muslin that she had never seen before that morning, when her aunt had presented it with a calculating expression that made Eleanor understand this sudden generosity had nothing to do with affection and everything to do with investment, with the possibility that the Duke of Pembroke's inexplicable interest might prove genuine and therefore profitable to the family. Isabella and Sophia sat opposite in matching pelisses of jonquil yellow, their beauty as perfectly coordinated as always. But today, Eleanor detected a brittle quality in their smiles, a tension in the way they held themselves, as if they were porcelain figures worried about cracking. The park was magnificent in its spring glory, cherry blossoms forming clouds of pale pink along the pathways, and the Serpentine gleamed like polished silver in the distance. And everywhere Eleanor looked, she saw the cream of society, strolling and riding and watching each other with avid eyes that missed nothing. Her hands twisted in her lap, that nervous gesture she could never quite control, and she told herself that the flutter in her chest was merely the anxiety of being on display in clothes finer than she was accustomed to wearing, not the treacherous hope that perhaps, impossibly, she might see him again. Then she did see him, and her breath caught in a way that surely everyone in the carriage must have noticed. Thomas Pembroke rode toward them on a magnificent bay horse, his dark riding coat fitted perfectly to his broad shoulders, and even from a distance Eleanor could see the moment he spotted their carriage, the way his posture changed, the purposefulness that entered his bearing as he altered his direction to intercept them. Lady Beatrice Sinclair stood in a cluster of gossips nearby, her eyes sharp as a hawk's, and Eleanor saw Miss Caroline Langley among them, beautiful and brittle in rose silk, her expression souring the moment she noticed the Duke's trajectory. Aunt Catherine's spine straightened with calculation, and Isabella and Sophia arranged themselves into postures of studied grace. But Thomas, when he drew his horse alongside and dismounted with fluid athleticism, handing his reins to a waiting groom, looked directly at Eleanor with such unmistakable intention that she felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Miss Ashford," he said, and the formality of the address could not disguise the warmth in his voice. "I wonder if you might consent to walk with me a while. The afternoon is too fine to waste in a carriage." It was the sort of request that could not easily be refused without causing offence, though Eleanor saw the flash of displeasure that crossed Isabella's face, quickly smoothed into false brightness, and she found herself accepting his hand as he helped her down from the barouche, his touch even through her glove, sending awareness thrumming through her entire body. And then they were walking together along the path, bordered with spring flowers, while the entire fashionable world watched and whispered and wondered. April 22nd, 1815. The package arrived at 6 o'clock in the evening, carried into the Ashford drawing-room by a liveried footman wearing the Pembroke colours, navy and silver, the brown paper wrapping bearing a wax seal, impressed with the ducal crest that made Aunt Catherine's teacup pause halfway to her lips, and Isabella's embroidery needle freeze mid-stitch, while Sophia leaned forward with sudden sharp attention, and Eleanor, seated in the corner chair that had always been hers, felt her heart begin that now familiar racing rhythm that seemed to accompany any mention or appearance of anything connected to Thomas Pembroke. The footman presented the package to her specifically. saying the Duke's instructions were that it be delivered into Miss Eleanor Ashford's hands directly, and the shock of hearing her full name spoken with such careful emphasis in the drawing-room, where she was usually simply Eleanor, if she was addressed at all, made her fingers tremble as she accepted the surprisingly heavy parcel. Aunt Catherine rose from her seat with the swift calculation of a general recognizing a shift in battlefield advantage, moving to stand behind Eleanor's chair, and Eleanor could feel the weight of 3 pairs of eyes watching as she carefully broke the Pembroke seal and unfolded the brown paper to reveal treasures that made her breath catch in wonder and disbelief. Sheet music, not the common publications one might find in any shop, but rare folios bound in leather, a collection of Mozart sonatas she had only heard existed, a set of Beethoven variations she had longed to see for years, editions so fine and costly that her hands hesitated to touch them for fear of somehow damaging what she could never afford to replace. A note lay atop the music, heavy cream paper with his handwriting, strong and clear and somehow exactly as she would have imagined his hand to be. The message brief but devastating in its thoughtfulness. For Miss Ashford, whose playing deserves the finest compositions and whose joy in music deserves every opportunity for expression. I hope these additions to your library bring you pleasure. Your servant, Pembroke. Eleanor stared at the words until they blurred, her throat tight with emotions she could not name, a feeling of being seen and valued that was so unfamiliar it felt almost painful. And behind her, Aunt Catherine made a small sound that might have been satisfaction or recalculation, while Isabella said in a voice like breaking glass, "How extraordinarily generous! The Duke must value accomplished musicianship very highly indeed," though everyone in the room understood the subtext beneath the polite words, the accusation and jealousy that turned the air bitter. Sophia remained silent, but her pretty face had gone hard as marble, and Eleanor clutched the precious folios to her chest, wanting suddenly to escape, to be alone with this impossible gift and the terrifying hope it represented. But Aunt Catherine's hand descended on her shoulder, holding her in place, and her aunt's voice when she spoke was warm in a way Eleanor had never heard directed at her before, though the warmth felt calculating rather than genuine, as false as stage scenery painted to look like stone. "We must compose a reply immediately, Eleanor, thanking His Grace for his extraordinary kindness and perhaps inviting him to call so he might hear you play some of these very pieces he has so thoughtfully selected." April 25th, 1815. Lady Sinclair's ballroom was smaller than the grand spaces Eleanor had played in before, more intimate in a way that made her feel exposed as she sat at the pianoforte in her new gown of pale lavender silk, another of Aunt Catherine's calculating investments, the delicate color making her skin seem less sallow than usual, though she hardly dared believe she looked anything approaching pretty, and the room glowed with candlelight that reflected off gilt-framed mirrors and created an atmosphere that felt almost dreamlike in its soft golden warmth. She had been playing for nearly an hour, her fingers moving through familiar pieces with the automatic grace that came from years of practice, though tonight her concentration kept fracturing, her awareness pulled constantly toward the tall figure across the room. Thomas Pembroke in black evening clothes with a sapphire pin at his throat that caught the light whenever he moved, and she had felt his gaze on her all evening with an intensity that made her hands tremble slightly against the keys. The gossip had reached a fever pitch over the past days, whispers following Eleanor everywhere she went, Lady Beatrice and her circle speculating endlessly about the Duke's intentions, while Miss Caroline Langley had turned coldly furious, her beauty curdling into something brittle and sharp. And even Isabella and Sophia had stopped pretending sisterly affection, their jealousy now naked and venomous, though Aunt Catherine had become all solicitous attention, her calculations written plainly across her face, each time she looked at Eleanor with new eyes that saw not a burden but a potential asset. Eleanor finished a Mozart variation and reached for the next sheet of music, one of the precious pieces Thomas had sent her. And then suddenly he was there beside her, moving through the crowd with that quiet authority that made people step aside without him having to ask, and he said with a slight smile that made her heart flutter absurdly, "May I turn pages for you, Miss Ashford? I should like to be useful." And before she could stammer a response, he had settled onto the bench beside her, so close she could feel the warmth of him, smell the subtle scent of sandalwood, and something else uniquely him, and the intimacy of the gesture, of him sitting with her in full view of everyone, made her breath catch even as her fingers found the keys and began the piece. They sat together in a small world created by music and proximity, his hands turning pages at precisely the right moments, as if he could read her intentions in the movement of her shoulders or the rhythm of her breathing. And between movements, he spoke quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone, telling her that he had felt like an outsider his entire life, despite his title and wealth. That duty had always come before desire, until he had heard her play and recognized something in her music that spoke to the loneliness he carried. And Eleanor felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble as she responded with matching vulnerability, admitting that she had spent so many years being invisible that she had convinced herself invisibility was safety, that hoping for anything more was foolishness that would only lead to pain. His hand covered hers on the keys for just a moment, the touch brief but devastating in its tenderness. And he said with quiet intensity that she had never been invisible to him, that from the first moment he had seen not plainness but grace, not a useful relation, but a woman of extraordinary depth and beauty that had nothing to do with the shallow measures society used. And Eleanor looked into his eyes and saw truth there, saw herself reflected back as someone worthy and valued and precious. And for the first time in her life, she allowed herself to truly hope, to believe that perhaps this impossible thing might actually be real. April 26th, 1815. The morning callers began arriving at 11 o'clock, filling the Ashford drawing-room with rustling silk and barely suppressed curiosity, and Eleanor sat on the sofa rather than her customary corner chair. This new positioning another of Aunt Catherine's calculated adjustments, placing her niece where she could be properly displayed like merchandise whose value had suddenly and unexpectedly increased, and the room seemed to buzz with speculation and gossip that swirled around Eleanor like smoke, making it difficult to breathe as Lady Beatrice Sinclair settled her considerable frame into the best chair and fixed Eleanor with eyes bright with intrusive interest, while Mrs. Westbrook, a widow known for her sharp tongue and sharper observations, arranged her shawl with elaborate care that fooled no one about her true purpose in calling, and even Miss Caroline Langley had come, her beauty today seeming brittle as ice, her smile tight and cold as she accepted tea from the silver service that Aunt Catherine poured with a graciousness that would have been laughable if Eleanor had possessed any capacity for amusement. The drawing-room had filled with flowers over the past days, arrangements from various gentlemen whose sudden interest in the previously invisible Miss Ashford was as transparent as it was overwhelming. Vases of hothouse roses and exotic lilies crowding every surface, their combined fragrances creating a cloying sweetness that made Eleanor feel slightly ill, though she knew the flowers were not tributes to her, but rather calculated attempts to gain favor with whoever might soon be the Duchess of Pembroke, and the thought made her feel soiled somehow, as if even this attention reduced her to nothing more than a means of social advancement. Isabella sat in the window seat wearing a morning dress of ice blue that matched the coldness in her eyes, her needlework lying forgotten in her lap while she watched the proceedings with barely concealed fury. And twice already she had made comments that sounded supportive on the surface but carried venom underneath. Observations about how extraordinary it was that musical skill could compensate for so many other deficiencies. How remarkable that some gentlemen valued accomplishment over beauty, and Eleanor felt each word like a small cut, death by 1,000 polite cruelties that left no visible wounds. Lady Beatrice leaned forward with the eagerness of a hound scenting prey, and said in a voice that carried to every corner of the room that the Duke had been most particular in his attentions, that everyone had noticed his marked preference, that sitting with Miss Ashford at the pianoforte for such an extended period had been a declaration of sorts. Had it not? And Eleanor felt heat rising in her cheeks as every eye fixed upon her, waiting for her response, while Aunt Catherine interjected smoothly that Eleanor was naturally gratified by his Grace's appreciation of her musical talents, the emphasis on talents making it clear that her aunt was already constructing narratives that centered family advantage rather than Eleanor's genuine worth. Mrs. Westbrook added with false sweetness that it would be quite the match, though of course one must not count chickens before they hatched. Such disappointments were not uncommon, particularly when expectations rose too high, and Eleanor felt the words land like blows, the implication clear that she should not dare hope too much, that someone like her had no right to expect permanence from the attention of someone like Thomas Pembroke. April 28th, 1815. The British Museum stood silent in the afternoon light, its marble halls echoing with footsteps that seemed to belong to another world entirely. And Eleanor walked beside Thomas Pembroke through the Greek sculpture gallery, wearing a day dress of rose-coloured muslin that Aunt Catherine had procured with the same calculating efficiency she now applied to everything concerning her previously dismissed niece. And the spring rain visible through the tall windows created a soft grey backdrop that made the white marble statues seem to glow with an inner luminescence. And at a respectful distance, Lord Frederick Harcourt stood near the entrance archway, his presence there to provide propriety, while also ensuring they had the privacy for genuine conversation. And Eleanor felt her heart beating so hard she was certain Thomas must hear it, must sense the terror and hope warring within her as they paused before a statue of Psyche, the goddess caught in marble at the moment of her transformation. And Thomas said quietly that he had asked her here today because he needed her to understand something, needed her to know the truth of his feelings before they went any further. And Eleanor turned to look at him with eyes that she knew revealed too much, all her vulnerability and longing exposed. And he took her arm with a touch that had become familiar over the past weeks, but which still sent warmth flooding through her entire body. And he said that he needed to know about her, about the life that had shaped her into the remarkable woman who sat at pianofortes playing music that spoke of depths society refused to see. And Eleanor felt something break open inside her chest, some long-sealed chamber where she had hidden all the pain and loneliness of 24 years, and she found herself telling him everything about her parents dying when she was 7, about coming to live with Aunt Catherine as an act of duty rather than love, about growing up watching Isabella and Sophia receive every advantage while she was given only what was necessary, about the slow-crushing realization that she was considered plain and poor and therefore worthless in the marriage market, about learning to find meaning in music because it was the only place she could express the feelings she was never permitted to show. And as she spoke, she felt tears sliding down her cheeks, though she had not meant to cry, had not meant to reveal quite so much. But Thomas listened with an intensity that made her feel truly heard for perhaps the first time in her life. And when she finally fell silent, he said with barely controlled anger that her family had committed a crime against her, that they had taken a sensitive, intelligent, beautiful woman and tried to convince her she was none of those things. And Eleanor started to protest the word beautiful out of habit, out of years of knowing her own face in mirrors and seeing plainness reflected back. But he touched her cheek with such tenderness that her words died unspoken, and he said that beauty had nothing to do with symmetry of features or fashionable coloring. That beauty was in the grace of her hands on piano keys, and the depths of her eyes, and the courage it took to remain kind when the world had been so unkind to her. And Eleanor felt something fundamental shifting inside her, some core belief about her own worth beginning to transform under the steady warmth of his regard. And he said that he was going to ask her a question very soon, that he wanted her to be prepared, and she knew what he meant, and felt simultaneously terrified and exalted, and his hand remained on her arm as they stood together in the quiet museum gallery, while rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows. And Frederick maintained his discreet distance, and Eleanor allowed herself for the first time to truly believe that perhaps the impossible might actually be about to become real. May 1st, 1815. Pembroke House stood ablaze with light as carriages lined the street, delivering London society to what promised to be the ball of the season. And Eleanor sat at the Broadwood pianoforte in the corner of the grandest ballroom she had ever seen, her fingers moving across keys of ivory and ebony, while her heart beat with a terror and anticipation so intense she felt dizzy with it, and she wore a gown of cream silk that Aunt Catherine had commissioned at staggering expense, the finest dress Eleanor had ever owned, the fabric whispering against her skin like a promise or perhaps a lie, and above her head 3 massive crystal chandeliers blazed with what must have been 1,000 candles, their light reflected in mirrors that lined the walls and multiplied the crowd until it seemed all of London had gathered in this space. And Eleanor played a Beethoven sonata because her hands knew the notes without thought, and her mind was too chaotic for anything requiring concentration, and she could see Isabella standing near the terrace doors in pale pink silk that made her look like a furious porcelain doll, her beauty tonight almost painful to behold, and her eyes fixed on Eleanor with something that looked remarkably like hatred, and Sophia stood beside their mother wearing amber silk and an expression of barely controlled resentment, and Aunt Catherine surveyed the room with the satisfaction of a general who had somehow, against all odds and expectations, maneuvered her least valuable piece into a position of stunning advantage. And Lady Beatrice Sinclair held court near the refreshment table, surrounded by other gossips, who kept glancing toward Eleanor with expressions ranging from disbelief to calculation. And Miss Caroline Langley stood alone near a window, looking brittle and dangerous in deep blue silk, her beauty tonight serving only to highlight the coldness in her eyes. And Lord Frederick Harcourt stood near the entrance, watching the proceedings with an expression of warm approval that suggested he knew exactly what was about to unfold. And Eleanor played on, while trying not to search the crowd for Thomas, trying not to hope too much or fear too greatly, trying to maintain some equilibrium in a world that had tilted so dramatically over the past weeks that she no longer recognized the contours of her own life. The ballroom itself seemed designed to overwhelm, all cream and gold with enormous windows draped in silk that moved gently in the spring breeze, and the scent of white roses filled the air, massive arrangements on every surface, and the crowd shifted and swirled in patterns Eleanor recognized from years of observation, the dance of society with all its cruelties and calculations. And she thought with a clarity that surprised her that tonight would determine everything, that whatever happened in the next hours would shape the entire remainder of her existence, and the terror of that realization made her fingers stumble slightly on the keys before she recovered and continued playing. And then she felt, rather than saw, a change in the room's atmosphere, a collective shift of attention. And she looked up to see Thomas Pembroke entering through the main doors, and he wore black evening clothes that emphasized his height and bearing, and the sapphire pin at his throat caught the candlelight, and his eyes swept the ballroom until they found her at the pianoforte. And the look he gave her was so intense, so full of purpose and determination, that Eleanor felt her breath catch and her heart began to race with a wild hope she could no longer suppress. Thomas walked across the ballroom floor with a purpose that silenced conversations as people turned to watch, and Eleanor's fingers faltered on the keys as she realized with a terror that stopped her breath that he was walking directly toward her, and the entire assembly seemed to hold its collective breath as the Duke of Pembroke crossed the polished floor past Isabella, whose face had gone white, and past Sophia, whose mouth opened in shock, and past Aunt Catherine, whose calculating expression shifted to confusion, and past Caroline Langley, who looked as though she might shatter like glass, and he reached the pianoforte where Eleanor sat frozen with her hands still resting on the keys, and he said in a voice that carried across the now completely silent ballroom that he must interrupt because he could not wait another moment, could not spend another evening watching the most remarkable woman in London play music for dancers when she should be celebrated and cherished and loved. And Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes as he extended his hand to her, and she took it without thinking, her fingers trembling in his warm, steady grip, and he helped her rise from the bench with such tenderness that she felt something break apart inside her chest, all the years of resignation and pain cracking open to let in light, and he kept her hand in his as he turned to face the assembled crowd. And he said that he had spent 3 weeks getting to know Miss Eleanor Ashford, that he had discovered in her a depth of soul and brilliance of mind and generosity of spirit that put every other woman of his acquaintance to shame, that her music spoke of beauty that society in its blindness had failed to recognize, that she had endured years of dismissal with a dignity that humbled him, and Eleanor stood beside him, weeping openly now, unable to stop the tears that streamed down her face. And he turned back to her and said that he had fallen in love with her the first night he heard her play, that every conversation since had only deepened his certainty, that she was everything he had ever wanted and had never dared hope to find. And then he released her hand only to reach into his coat pocket and withdraw a ring, a sapphire set in gold that matched the pin at his throat. And he went down on one knee before her in front of 300 witnesses, and he said, "Eleanor Ashford, will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife, of allowing me to spend my life ensuring you never doubt your worth again, of letting me love you as you deserve to be loved?" And Eleanor looked down at him through her tears and saw in his eyes such absolute certainty, such complete devotion, that the last of her disbelief shattered like crystal, and she said yes in a voice that broke on the word, "Yes, with all my heart, yes." And he rose and slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her into his arms right there before everyone, propriety abandoned in favor of truth. And the ballroom erupted in applause and exclamations, and Eleanor heard Frederick Harcourt's delighted laugh, and saw Aunt Catherine's stunned face, and Isabella's devastated expression, and Sophia's tears of jealous rage, and Caroline Langley fleeing toward the doors, and Lady Beatrice Sinclair clapping with an expression of genuine surprise. But mostly she was aware only of Thomas holding her close and whispering against her hair that she was his now, that he would never let anyone make her feel less than precious again. And Eleanor clung to him and wept and felt herself transformed in an instant from invisible pianist to beloved duchess, from overlooked poor relation to the most envied woman in London. And the impossibility of it all made her dizzy, even as the solid reality of his arms around her anchored her to this new, miraculous truth. Thomas led Eleanor through the French doors onto the terrace, where the cool night air carried the scent of roses and jasmine from the gardens below, and the noise of the ballroom faded to a muted hum behind them, and Eleanor felt her legs trembling beneath the cream silk of her gown as the events of the past hour crashed over her in waves that left her dizzy and breathless, and Thomas kept his hand at the small of her back, as though he feared she might collapse without his support. and perhaps she would have, because nothing in her 24 years had prepared her for this transformation from invisible pianist to beloved duchess, from dismissed poor relation to the woman every other lady in London now envied. And they reached the stone balustrade that overlooked the gardens where lanterns glowed among the trees like captured stars, and Thomas turned her gently to face him, and in the lamplight from the ballroom his eyes were very dark and very tender, and he said, "Are you all right?" And Eleanor found she could not speak, because if she opened her mouth, she would either laugh hysterically or weep again, and he seemed to understand because he pulled her close and simply held her while she shook with emotions too large and complex to name, and after a long moment she managed to whisper against his chest that she could not quite believe this was happening, that some part of her still expected to wake at her narrow bed in the servants' corridor and discover it had all been a dream born of desperate longing. And Thomas drew back just enough to frame her face with his hands. And he said, "Look at me, Eleanor." And she lifted her eyes to his. And he said, "This is real. I am real. My love for you is the most real thing I have ever experienced. And you are wearing my ring, and in 6 weeks you will wear my name. And for the rest of our lives I will wake beside you and fall asleep holding you, and never let you doubt for one moment that you are precious beyond measure." And Eleanor felt fresh tears slide down her cheeks as she raised her left hand to look at the sapphire that caught the lamplight and threw blue fire. And she said, "I do not understand why you chose me when you could have had anyone. Any of the beautiful, accomplished women who have been throwing themselves at you all season." And Thomas smiled and said, "But none of them are you. None of them have your soul or your mind or your extraordinary gift for finding beauty, even in circumstances designed to crush it. None of them have survived what you have survived, and emerged with your kindness intact. And I did not fall in love with a face, Eleanor, though I find yours lovely beyond words. I fell in love with the woman who played Mozart as though she were speaking, directly to heaven, who discussed Rossini with intelligence that left me breathless, who has been overlooked and dismissed and yet somehow retained the capacity to hope." And Eleanor said I had stopped hoping. I had accepted that love was not for me. And Thomas said, "I know. And that is why I had to hope enough for both of us until you could remember how." They stood together on the terrace for a long time, while the sounds of celebration drifted from the ballroom behind them, and the night air wrapped around them like a blessing. And gradually, Eleanor's trembling eased, and her tears stopped, and she found herself able to breathe again, without feeling as though the world might shatter at any moment. And Thomas kept one arm around her waist, and used his free hand to trace the line of her jaw with such gentleness that fresh emotion rose in her throat. And he said, "We should return to the ballroom soon, or people will talk, though I find I care very little about propriety when I could stay here with you forever." And Eleanor managed a shaky laugh, and said that after proposing in front of 300 witnesses, he had rather surrendered any claim to propriety. And he grinned and said that was rather the point, that he wanted every person in London to know, without question, that she was his chosen bride, that there would be no whispered speculation about obligation or pity or any of the cruel nonsense society might otherwise invent. And Eleanor looked up at him and said, "You knew they would say those things?" And Thomas said, "Of course, I know how this world works, how it tears down anything that challenges its narrow definitions of worth, and that is precisely why I made my declaration so public and so absolute, so that no one could question my devotion, or suggest you had somehow trapped me, or that I had settled for less than my heart's desire." And Eleanor felt something warm unfurl in her chest at his protectiveness, at the careful thought he had given to shielding her from the very cruelty she had feared. And she said, "I do not deserve you." And Thomas made an impatient sound and said, "You deserve far more than me, but I am selfish enough to be grateful you have accepted me anyway." And then he grew serious and said, "Eleanor, I need you to understand that the next weeks will not be easy, that there will be people who resent our happiness, and others who will test your confidence with barbed comments disguised as concern, that my world can be vicious to those it perceives as outsiders." And Eleanor said, "I have lived as an outsider my entire life." And Thomas said, "I know, but it is different when you are beside me because they cannot dismiss you outright. So instead they will try to undermine you subtly. And I need you to promise that when the doubts come, as I know they will, you will remember this moment and trust that my love is not circumstantial or temporary, but absolute." And Eleanor felt tears threaten again at his understanding of her deepest fear, the terror that one day he would wake and see her as the world had always seen her, plain and poor and unremarkable. And she whispered, "What if you change your mind?" And Thomas pulled her close and said, "I will not, I cannot, you are written into my heart now, and nothing could alter that." And Eleanor pressed her face against his chest, and felt his heartbeat steady beneath her cheek, and let herself believe, for the first time, that perhaps happy endings were not only for beautiful women in fairy stories, but also for overlooked pianists who had learned to expect nothing, and were learning now to accept everything. When they finally returned to the ballroom, the atmosphere had transformed into something Eleanor had never experienced, a celebration that seemed to shimmer with genuine warmth rather than the brittle politeness that usually characterized society gatherings. And she entered on Thomas's arm, with her left hand resting in the crook of his elbow so that the sapphire caught the light from the 3 massive crystal chandeliers, and announced her new status to anyone who had somehow missed the proposal. And immediately they were surrounded by well-wishers whose faces blurred together in Eleanor's overwhelmed state, though she registered Frederick Harcourt's enthusiastic congratulations and his whispered comment to Thomas that it was about time. And even Lady Beatrice Sinclair approached with what appeared to be sincere pleasure and said she had never seen a more romantic gesture in 40 years of attending society events. And Eleanor found herself swept into conversations with women who had never before acknowledged her existence, ladies who now seemed eager to befriend the future Duchess of Pembroke, though she could not help but notice the bitter knot of her cousins standing near the refreshment table with identical expressions of poorly concealed fury. And Aunt Catherine approached with Lord Robert trailing behind, and her aunt's face was a complicated mixture of calculation and genuine surprise. And she said, "Eleanor, dear, I always knew you had hidden qualities," though her tone suggested she had known nothing of the sort. And Thomas kept Eleanor close throughout all of it with his hand at her waist, or on her arm as though he feared she might disappear if he released her, and she was grateful for his steady presence, because without it, she might have fled the overwhelming attention that felt both wonderful and terrifying in equal measure. And after what felt like hours but was perhaps only 30 minutes, Thomas leaned down and murmured that they had fulfilled their social obligations, and he was taking her home before she collapsed from exhaustion. And Eleanor felt a rush of gratitude for his perception because her legs had begun trembling again, and her head ached from the emotional tumult of the evening, and they made their way toward the door while accepting final congratulations, and Thomas sent a footman ahead to have his carriage brought around. And as they waited in the entrance hall, Eleanor caught sight of Caroline Langley watching from the ballroom doorway with such naked hatred that Eleanor instinctively moved closer to Thomas, and he followed her gaze, and his expression hardened, and he said loud enough for Caroline to hear that he had never been more certain of any decision in his life. And then the carriage arrived, and he handed Eleanor up and climbed in behind her, and as they pulled away from Pembroke House with its blazing windows and sounds of continued celebration, Eleanor finally allowed herself to lean against his shoulder and close her eyes. And Thomas wrapped his arm around her and pressed a kiss to the top of her head and said, "You did beautifully," and Eleanor whispered that she felt as though she had survived a battle, And Thomas said, "In many ways you have, but the victory is ours and nothing will take it from us." The carriage rolled through London's darkened streets with the rhythm of hoofbeats, providing a steady counterpoint to Eleanor's racing thoughts, and she found herself unable to stop touching the sapphire ring on her left hand, as though confirming its reality with each gentle rotation against her finger. And Thomas watched her with an expression of such tenderness that she felt simultaneously exposed and cherished. And after several minutes of companionable silence, he said, "You are very quiet, and I cannot tell if that is contentment or terror." And Eleanor managed a shaky laugh and said perhaps both. And he smiled and said that seems a reasonable response to having one's entire life transformed in the space of a single evening. And Eleanor looked out the window at the passing townhouses with their illuminated windows, suggesting other lives continuing in their ordinary patterns, while hers had been irrevocably altered. And she said, "Do you ever feel as though you are watching yourself from outside your own body? As though you cannot quite believe what is happening is real?" And Thomas said, "I felt precisely that way when I first heard you play at your aunt's ball, as though I had been sleepwalking through my life until that moment, and suddenly woke to find everything changed." And Eleanor turned to look at him in the dim light filtering through the carriage windows and said, "You cannot mean that." And Thomas said, "I have never been more sincere. I had attended 1,000 such gatherings and met countless eligible women and felt nothing beyond polite interest. But then I heard your music and saw your face, and something shifted in my chest, and Eleanor felt tears threaten again because she had spent so many years believing herself invisible that even now, with the evidence of his love surrounding her, some part of her struggled to accept it. And she said, "I am so afraid." And Thomas reached for her hand and said, "I know, but I promise you that fear will ease with time as you learn to trust that my devotion is not contingent on anything you must perform or maintain, but simply exists as a permanent fact." And Eleanor said, "How? Can you be so certain?" And Thomas said, "Because I know my own heart, and it recognized yours the moment we met." And the carriage turned onto the quieter street, where the Ashford townhouse stood, with its familiar facade that suddenly seemed strange to Eleanor, as though she were seeing it for the first time. And Thomas said, "I will call tomorrow at 2 in the afternoon to speak with your uncle formally about settlements and such tedious matters, though of course your answer tonight has already bound us." And Eleanor nodded and said, "Aunt Catherine will be insufferable with triumph." And Thomas said, "Let her have her moment of social victory if it makes your remaining time in that house more bearable, though I intend for that time to be as brief as propriety allows." And Eleanor said, "You wish to marry soon." And Thomas said, "I wish to marry immediately, but I suspect society requires at least a few weeks of pretense that we are not both counting the hours." And the carriage stopped, and a footman appeared to open the door, and Eleanor suddenly did not want to leave the enclosed space that felt like its own private world. And Thomas seemed to understand, because he said one more moment, and he cupped her face in his hands and said, "You are mine now. Eleanor and I am yours, and nothing will change that." And then he kissed her forehead with such gentleness that she felt something inside her finally begin to believe. And he helped her down from the carriage and escorted her to the door, where Aunt Catherine's butler waited with carefully neutral expression. And Thomas lifted her hand to his lips and said, "Until tomorrow," and Eleanor whispered good night and watched him return to his carriage before turning to enter the house where her life as the future Duchess of Pembroke would begin to take shape. The morning of May the 2nd arrived with brilliant sunshine streaming through Eleanor's bedroom window, where she had slept only fitfully, waking repeatedly to check that the sapphire ring still circled her finger and proved the previous evening had not been an elaborate dream conjured by her desperate imagination. And when her maid Mary arrived at 8 with morning chocolate, the girl's face was alight with barely suppressed excitement, as she said the entire household was talking of nothing but Miss Eleanor's engagement, and cook had already begun planning celebration menus, though no one had instructed her to do so, and Eleanor felt a strange mixture of pleasure and discomfort at being the subject of such attention after 24 years of being effectively invisible within these walls. And Mary helped her dress in a morning gown of sprigged muslin that Aunt Catherine had provided just last week as part of the sudden investment in Eleanor's wardrobe, and Eleanor noticed how differently the fabric felt against her skin now that she wore it as the future Duchess of Pembroke rather than as the poor relation being displayed for potential advantage. And when she descended to the breakfast room at 9, she found the entire family already assembled, which was unusual since Isabella and Sophia typically took breakfast in their rooms, and Aunt Catherine looked up from her correspondence with an expression that Eleanor had never seen directed at her before, something approaching respect mingled with calculation, and her aunt said, "Good morning, Eleanor. I trust you slept well after such an eventful evening." And Eleanor said, "As well as could be expected," and Uncle Robert lowered his newspaper and said the Duke sent word he will call at 2, as promised, to discuss settlements. And there was an odd note in his voice as though he could not quite reconcile the quiet niece he had barely noticed with the woman who had captured London's most eligible bachelor. And Isabella sat rigid in her chair, with her face carefully composed, but her hands gripping her teacup so tightly that Eleanor feared the delicate porcelain might shatter. And Sophia would not meet Eleanor's eyes at all, but stared fixedly at her plate while pushing eggs around with her fork, and Aunt Catherine said we must discuss the wedding arrangements. Naturally, it will be the event of the season, and we must ensure everything reflects appropriately on both families. And Eleanor said, "Thomas and I have not yet discussed such details," and the use of his Christian name felt strange on her tongue in this company, though he had explicitly given her permission to use it during their terrace conversation. And Aunt Catherine said, "Nevertheless, we must begin planning immediately. These things take time, and I assume the Duke will wish to marry before the season ends." And Eleanor felt the familiar sensation of being managed and directed that had characterized her entire life in this household. But now there was a crucial difference, because Thomas had promised her that she would have choices and agency in shaping their future together, and she said with more firmness than she had ever used with her aunt that she would discuss all such matters with Thomas first. And Aunt Catherine's eyes widened slightly at this unprecedented assertion of independence, and Uncle Robert made a sound that might have been a surprised laugh quickly converted into a cough, and Isabella said in a voice dripping with barely concealed venom that Eleanor must be very proud of herself for entrapping a duke through whatever means she employed, and the words hung in the air like poison, and Eleanor felt her face flame with hurt and anger, and before she could formulate a response, Aunt Catherine said sharply that Isabella would apologize immediately, and Isabella's mouth tightened, but she muttered something that might have been an apology, though it sounded more like a curse, and Eleanor realized with sudden clarity that she no longer had to endure such treatment, because in a matter of weeks she would leave this house forever, and these people would have no power over her except what she chose to give them. Eleanor excused herself from the table as soon as she could manage without appearing rude, and retreated to the small sitting room on the second floor that had long served as her refuge within this house, where she had never truly belonged. And she sank onto the window seat overlooking the street and pressed her forehead against the cool glass while trying to steady her breathing and calm the storm of emotions that Isabella's venomous words had stirred within her, and she knew that her cousin spoke from wounded pride and jealousy. But the accusation of entrapment cut deeply, because some part of Eleanor still could not quite believe that Thomas had chosen her freely, without manipulation or deception on her part. And she twisted the sapphire ring on her finger and thought about how quickly everything had changed, and how unstable it all still felt, as though the entire edifice of her new future might collapse if she examined it too closely or allowed herself to believe in it too completely. And she heard footsteps in the hallway and tensed, expecting Aunt Catherine with more instructions, or Isabella with more poison. But instead Sophia's voice came softly through the door, asking if she might enter. And Eleanor said yes with some surprise, because Sophia had barely spoken to her since the engagement, and her younger cousin slipped into the room and closed the door behind her and stood there looking uncomfortable and uncertain in a way that was unfamiliar on her usually confident face. And after a long moment, Sophia said, "I wanted to apologize for my behavior, and for Isabella's, though I cannot speak for her." And Eleanor said, "There is no need." And Sophia shook her head and said, "There is every need, because we have been cruel to you for years, and I did not realize until last night how deeply cruel." And she crossed to the window seat and sat down beside Eleanor, with her hands folded in her lap, and said, "I watched the Duke propose to you, and I saw the way he looked at you, as though you were the only person in the entire ballroom, and I realized that no one has ever looked at me that way, despite all my supposed beauty." And Eleanor did not know what to say to this unexpected confession, and so she remained silent. And Sophia continued saying, "I think I have been angry at you because you have always seemed content with so little, while Isabella and I have grasped for everything and still felt empty." And Eleanor said, "I was not content. I was resigned, which is quite different." And Sophia nodded and said, "I suppose that is true." And she reached out tentatively and touched Eleanor's hand and said, "I hope you will be very happy, because I think you deserve it more than anyone I know." And Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at this unexpected kindness from a quarter where she had expected only continued hostility. And she said, "Thank you, that means more than you might imagine." And Sophia smiled sadly and said, "Isabella will not come around so easily. She has always needed to win at everything, and she sees your engagement as a personal defeat." And Eleanor said, "I did not set out to defeat anyone. I only played the pianoforte and spoke honestly when the Duke addressed me." And Sophia said, "I know, but Isabella cannot see it that way. She can only see that the prize she wanted went to someone she considered beneath her notice." And they sat together in companionable silence for several minutes, watching the street below where carriages passed, and servants hurried on morning errands. And then Sophia said, "Will you invite us to the wedding?" And Eleanor said, "Of course you are my family, despite everything." And Sophia said, "I am not sure we deserve that consideration, but I am grateful for it." And she stood and smoothed her skirts and said, "I should go before Isabella comes looking for me and makes a scene." And she paused at the door and added, "I truly am happy for you, Eleanor." And then she was gone, leaving Eleanor alone with her thoughts and the sound of the morning city drifting through the window. Thomas arrived at precisely 2 in the afternoon, as promised, and Eleanor watched from the first-floor window as his carriage pulled up before the house bearing the Pembroke crest in gold and deep blue, and she felt her heart-beat quicken at the sight of him descending to the pavement in a coat of dark grey superfine that made his broad shoulders even more imposing, and she pressed her palm against the cool glass and thought how strange it was that this man who commanded such presence and respect in society had chosen her above all others, and had done so in the most public manner imaginable. And she heard the front door open below and the murmur of voices as Thomas was admitted by the butler, and Aunt Catherine appeared in the doorway behind her, saying, "Come, Eleanor, your betrothed is here, and we must not keep him waiting." And there was an unfamiliar deference in her aunt's tone that would have been laughable if it were not so pointed a reminder of how little respect Eleanor had received before becoming valuable through association. And Eleanor turned from the window and smoothed the skirts of her afternoon dress, which was a soft green muslin that Mary had said brought out the colour of her eyes, though Eleanor still found it difficult to think of herself as someone whose appearance merited such attention, and she followed her aunt down the stairs to the main drawing-room, where Uncle Robert and Thomas stood near the fireplace engaged in conversation that ceased the moment Eleanor entered, and Thomas's face transformed when he saw her with a smile that held such warmth and genuine pleasure that Eleanor felt her lingering doubts begin to dissolve like morning mist under sun, and he crossed to her immediately and took her hand and raised it to his lips in a gesture that was both formally proper and intimately personal. And he said, "Miss Ashford, you look lovely this afternoon." And she said, "Thank you." "Your Grace," though the title felt wrong now, after he had asked her last night to call him Thomas when they were private, and Uncle Robert cleared his throat and said, "Shall we discuss the settlement arrangements?" And Thomas said, "Of course. But first I wonder if I might have a brief moment alone with my betrothed." And there was the slightest emphasis on the word alone that made it clear this was not truly a request, but rather an expectation, and Uncle Robert looked momentarily nonplussed at being managed in his own home. But Aunt Catherine said smoothly, "Of course, Your Grace. We shall be in the library when you are ready." And she placed a hand on her husband's arm and guided him from the room, though not before shooting Eleanor a look that conveyed both warning and instruction about proper behavior. And then the door closed, and Eleanor and Thomas were alone for the first time since the terrace conversation last evening, and he released her hand only to take both of hers in his, and said, "I wanted to see you without an audience, even if only for a moment, to ask how you are truly feeling about all of this." And Eleanor said, "I am still trying to believe it is real." And he said, "I understand that it must seem sudden despite the weeks we have been acquainted." And she said, "It is not the suddenness so much as the impossibility." And he frowned slightly and said, "What do you mean by impossibility?" And Eleanor said, "Only that I never imagined someone like you would choose someone like me." And his frown deepened. And he said, "Eleanor, we discussed this last night, and I thought I had made my feelings clear." And she said, "You did, but a lifetime of believing one thing cannot be undone by a single evening, no matter how extraordinary." And he was quiet for a moment, studying her face with those grey eyes that seemed to see far more than she wished to reveal. And then he said, "I suppose that is fair, and I must be patient while you learn to see yourself as I see you." And he raised one hand to cup her cheek in a gesture so tender that Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. And he said, "I will spend our entire marriage showing you your worth if that is what it requires." And Eleanor said, "That seems an inefficient use of a duke's time." And he laughed and said, "I cannot think of any better use of my time than convincing my wife that she is extraordinary." The settlement discussions proceeded with the careful formality that such matters required, though Eleanor found it difficult to concentrate on the details of portions and pin money and property arrangements, when her mind kept drifting back to Thomas's words about spending their marriage showing her worth. And she sat in the library beside him on the green velvet settee while Uncle Robert and the solicitor Thomas had brought reviewed documents filled with legal language that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify, and Aunt Catherine hovered nearby, offering opinions that no one had requested about what was proper and expected for a duchess, though her expertise on such matters was entirely theoretical, and Eleanor noted with some bitter amusement how her aunt's tone had transformed from dismissive condescension to obsequious deference, as though Eleanor had become an entirely different person overnight, when in truth she was exactly who she had always been. And Thomas's hand rested near hers on the settee, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence, but not quite touching in deference to propriety, though she noticed that his smallest finger had moved almost imperceptibly closer until it just barely brushed against her own, and the tiny contact sent awareness singing through her nerves and made her even less capable of following the conversation about investments and interest rates and annual incomes. And Uncle Robert was saying something about the Ashford family's contribution to the settlement, and Thomas responded with polite firmness that no contribution was necessary, as he was more than capable of providing for his wife in the style befitting her new position, and there was the slightest emphasis on the word wife that made Eleanor's breath catch and her heart perform an erratic flutter behind her ribs, and the solicitor droned on about property in Kent and holdings in Derbyshire and a house in London's most fashionable square, and Eleanor realized with mounting disbelief that she was hearing an accounting of the life that would soon be hers. And she thought about the small, cramped room she had occupied in her aunt's house for the past 8 years, since her parents' deaths had left her dependent on their charity, and how different her existence would be as the Duchess of Pembroke, with households to manage and social position to maintain, and the magnitude of the change threatened to overwhelm her until she felt Thomas's finger press more firmly against hers in what she recognized as deliberate reassurance, and she glanced at him and found him watching her with concern evident in those grey eyes, despite his continued attention to the legal discussion, and he said to the room at large, "I think we have covered the essential points for today, and the details can be finalized in writing." And Uncle Robert looked as though he might protest, but Thomas was already standing and offering his hand to Eleanor, saying, "I promised to take my betrothed for a drive this afternoon, and we should not keep the horses waiting." And Eleanor accepted his hand and rose, grateful for the escape from the stuffy library and her aunt's calculating presence. And within minutes they were settled in his curricle, with Frederick riding at a discreet distance behind, and Thomas guiding the matched bays through London's crowded streets toward the relative peace of the park. And Eleanor said, "Thank you for extracting us. I was beginning to feel quite suffocated." And Thomas said, "I could see that you were uncomfortable, and I will not have our future reduced to dry legal documents and my solicitor's monotone." And she smiled and said, "The settlements are necessary, though." And he said they are, but they are not what matters. And Eleanor said, "What matters then?" And Thomas looked at her with such intensity that she felt heat rise in her cheeks. And he said, "You matter, Eleanor, and I matter, and what we will build together matters, and all the rest is merely paperwork." The drive through Hyde Park proceeded at a leisurely pace that allowed Eleanor to observe how differently the world treated her now that she sat beside the Duke of Pembroke in his elegant curricle with the Pembroke crest painted on the door. And she noticed how heads turned as they passed, and how ladies whispered behind gloved hands, and how gentlemen nodded with respect, where before she had been invisible to society's notice. And Thomas guided the bays with easy competence along the familiar paths where only days ago he had walked beside her, while scandal-hungry observers watched and speculated. And Eleanor said, "It is strange how quickly everything has changed when I myself am exactly the same person I was a week ago." And Thomas glanced at her with those penetrating grey eyes and said, "You are the same, but the world's perception has shifted, and that reveals more about the world than about you." And she said, "Still it is disorienting to be noticed after so many years of being overlooked." And he said, "You were never overlooked by me from the very first moment I heard you play." And Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest at his words, even as she struggled to reconcile this new reality with the lifetime of dismissal that had preceded it, and they passed Lady Beatrice Sinclair's carriage, and Eleanor saw the older woman's avid interest as she took in every detail of Eleanor's position beside Thomas and the sapphire ring now visible on her left hand. And Thomas said, "Lady Beatrice will have spread the news to half of London by this evening, and Eleanor said the other half already knows from those who attended your ball last night." And he smiled and said, "Good, let them all know that you are mine and I am yours." And the possessiveness in his tone sent a shiver down Eleanor's spine that was not entirely unpleasant. And she said, "Are you not concerned about what they will say about your choice?" And Thomas said, "I am not remotely concerned about the opinions of people whose judgment is so flawed they could not recognize your worth." And his certainty on this point was both reassuring and bewildering to Eleanor, who had spent her entire life shaped by others' poor opinions. And they turned onto a quieter path where the trees grew thick enough to provide some privacy from the watching crowds. And Thomas slowed the horses and said, "Eleanor, I need you to understand something important." And she looked at him and waited. And he said, "I know that you have been taught to value yourself according to measurements that are arbitrary and cruel, but I need you to begin learning a different measure." And Eleanor said, "What measure is that?" And he said, "Your intelligence, your talent, your kindness, your courage in bearing years of unkindness without becoming bitter yourself." And she felt tears prick her eyes and said, "I am not sure I possess all those qualities you attribute to me." And Thomas reached over and took her hand in his and said, "That is precisely the problem. Eleanor, you cannot see yourself clearly because you have been looking in mirrors held up by people who were too small-minded to recognize brilliance when it sat before them." And Eleanor said, "And you believe you see me clearly?" And he said, "I believe I see you more clearly than you see yourself. And I intend to spend our marriage teaching you to see what I see." And Eleanor said, "That is the second time today you have mentioned teaching me about my own worth." And Thomas said, "It bears repeating until you believe it." And she said, "You are very determined." And he said, "I am a duke. Eleanor determination is rather a requirement of the position." And despite the emotional intensity of the conversation, Eleanor found herself laughing. And Thomas looked pleased and said, "There now, that is better. I much prefer to see you smile than to see you doubting."